Hello and welcome back to I'm Sure I Still Have a Hairline History. Hello and welcome back to Short King History. Hello all, and welcome to my first video. The goal of this series is to shed some fun and informative light onto the history of flat earth ideas, specifically the place that flat earthism has in the history of science. See? Look, it's Einstein. Yeah, I know what I'm talking about, okay? Now you may be saying, who is this guy? And what authority does he have to speak on any of this? The answer is absolutely none. A resounding none at all. Besides the fact that I'm an undergrad student in the history of science, and I have a passion for anything weird and other, especially in the context of science, and I want to share that with all of you who may be watching. Lastly, before we get into it, this video was sponsored by Raid Shadow Legends. No. I wish. Not really. Shoot me in the head. This is based off of a wonderful book on the history of science and flat earth called Flat Earth, The History of an Infamous Idea by Christine Garwood. It offers a better and deeper look into most of what I'm going to be talking about today, so if you're interested, please check out her book. I'm going to link it down below in the description. Before we can get into any fun modern, and by modern I mean modern in the same way that Chuck Testa memes are modern. Technically modern, but still very, very old. Flat earthism, we first have to look at where the modern day flat earth myth originates. We've all heard it. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue to discover America and to prove the earth was not flat. What you might not know is this is all wrong. This story is almost completely fake. At least the part about proving the Earth's rotundity is. Yeah, that's right, I'm pulling out rotundity. The Columbus myth was actually started by Washington Irving. You know, that Washington Irving. And the crowd goes wild in recognition. That's a secret. They don't recognize him. You've definitely heard of him, though. Washington Irving is famous for writing the tale of Sleepy Hollow and the story of Rip Van Winkle. Irving rose to fame when he wrote A History of New York, from the beginning of the world to the end of the Dutch dynasty in 1809 under the pseudonym Diedrich Knickerbocker. No, not Orville Redenbacher, Knickerbocker. This was a satirical history of New York, written to mock the boring histories of his day. Written with quick wit and a clever blending of fact with fiction, the book and Irving were an immediate success. So much so that the term Knickerbocker has supposedly come to commonly refer to Dutch settlers in New York, or more specifically the fancy pants that they wear. But I've never heard of that. Anyways, after writing his history of New York and the folktales he's best known for, Irving wanted a more serious literary reputation. So, he went to Spain to translate newly found historical documents about Columbus. There he found that they were enough to write a book about. That's right! Cha-ching, baby! So, Irving goes about writing this book, trying to write an accurate, but more importantly, interesting history about Columbus's life. Unfortunately, he erred much more on the side of interesting than accurate. To achieve the book sales he wanted, he painted Columbus as a humble, yet rational mariner who had to argue and reason with Queen Isabella's counselors who were learned churchmen and scientists about how the voyage would not fall off the edge of the flat earth. Quick side note here, to use scientists is an anachronistic term. Scientists, as you and I would conceive of them, would probably not manifest until around the start of the 20th century, or possibly even later. To say what a scientist is in the history of science is a contentious topic, to say the least. I would say that this is the kind of argument that would come to blows, except there are never enough historians of science in one place to even, well, come to blows. Proving that this myth, originally written by Irving, is false was relatively easy, even for the people of his time. And the fact that Renaissance and more ancient peoples believed that the earth was round is one of the most well accepted in the history of science. Both Plato and Aristotle believed the earth to be a sphere. Aristotle argued that the nature of the cosmos was different celestial spheres held in one another, with the sphere at the very center of the universe being the Earth. He had different pieces of evidence for this. He thought the Earth was a sphere because of how he believed the elements to act. Water and earth, being heavy, naturally went to the very center of the universe, thus creating a sphere of, well, the Earth. Air and fire were the lightest elements, forming spheres around the Earth, just before the sphere of the Moon. While this idea may sound crazy to you, Aristotle was the accepted academic source for almost all of science in the Western world until around the 17th century when Descartes came around. So, there was never any real debate, even among medieval people, as to the shape of the Earth. If ancient and medieval people never believed the Earth to be flat, the question becomes, how did Irving's take that the people around Columbus, believing that the Earth was flat, become so ubiquitous, even today? Garwood argues, and I agree, that the rise of the Columbus myth is due to two intra-related myths. One, that there was a period in history known as the Dark Ages where science stopped happening, and two, that science was fighting a battle with the church for progress. I will go over each of these in turn. Just like it is a popular misconception that the people during Columbus's lifetime believed the Earth to be flat, so too is the popular misconception of the Dark Ages. The name evokes a time where all rationality and learning stopped in favor of holing up inside the nearest castle and praying like your life depended on it. This is also widely considered false in the history of science community. However, to what extent and what kind of science was happening during this time period is also very contentious. Again, though, not actually enough historians of science to, fight. Here, I will make the argument that the Dark Ages, generally considered the time period of around 400 CE till around 1200 CE, didn't really ever exist, not at least to the extent with which popular culture has led us to believe. Yep, folks, I really had to do it for this segment. I had to break out old books that I have. Books. Gosh. Remember those? It's not even the nice Garwood ebook that I've been reading. So hey you, I see you. You're gonna have to appreciate this one extra for me. Okay? Yeah, I'm looking at you. The following information comes from David Lindbergh's book, The Beginnings of Western Science. I'll also link that down in the description. The first example I bring to counter the doom and gloom of the Dark Ages is of an archbishop named Isidore of Seville. He was an archbishop of Seville in Spain in the year 600. He had works on biblical studies, liturgy, and history. His non-religious texts include On the Nature of Things. For those history of science majors playing along, this is also the same name as the poem by the Roman author Lucretius. And Isidore also wrote Etymology. On the Nature of Things is a book on natural science that was drawn from both pagan and religious sources that gives an overview of Greek natural philosophy. For those of you who studied a useful major in college, natural philosophy is just another name for the closest approximation of what we would consider science. This nomenclature was not changed until around the 20th century. In Etymologies, one of the most popular books of the Dark Ages, Isidore gives an account of things by the etymologies of their names, encyclopedia style. It covers the 7 liberal arts, medicine, law, timekeeping in the calendar, theology, anthropology, geography, cosmology, mineralogy, and agriculture. Oh, also, he argued that the Earth was a sphere. Clearly, for somebody in the Dark Ages, Isidore was well educated, and while a standout figure, there was nothing that made him extraordinary or his opinions different from other learned people of his time. The second example I have is of the Carolingian reforms. Carolingian refers to the empire under Charlemagne, started around 768 CE. No, not that Charlemagne, this Charlemagne. Under Charlemagne's reforms, cathedral schools were created to foster a learned middle class of clergymen to be church administrators. These schools, of course, taught theological, ecclesiastical, and when relevant, scientific and philosophical issues. These cathedral schools went on to grow and grow, eventually forming into universities in Europe, including some we know today, like Oxford, the University of Paris, and the University of Padua, where famously Galileo got his start. While these are just two examples of learning in the Middle Ages, I promise that there are many more, and I hope to have shown that the Dark Ages weren't quite as dark as you may have first assumed. Now, on to the second part of Garwood's argument, the myth that there was a battle between science and religion. This myth was disseminated largely by historians and scientists who were religious, but who also had some specific daddy issues with the church. Although amorphous, the time period of pushing religion as the opposite of science generally occurred in the 19th century, around and after Irving's biography of Columbus. Anti-clericals during the 19th century, like Alphonse de Lamartine and Voltairian academic Antoine-Jean Letron, used the idea that early Christians believed the earth was flat to push their anti-Christian agenda. Specifically, an article by Letron called On the Cosmological Opinions of the Church Fathers. Published just 6 years after Irving's biography, Letron's article became especially William Whewell, a Cambridge University vice-chancellor and best-known historian of science of his day, published The History of Inductive Sciences, which painted the Dark, or Middle Ages, as an era characterized by religious dogma and lack of scientific advancement. In the later editions of his book, he talked about two medieval Christian flat earth proponents to advocate for his progressivist worldview. The first he talked about was early Christian author Firmianus Lactantius, who wrote around 300 CE, talking about how a spherical earth was a marvelous fiction, spread by pagans and atheists for a jest, and, since the Bible didn't talk about the shape of the earth, it really didn't matter anyways. After his death, Lactantius was declared heretical, and his views, obscure even during his lifetime, did little to impact contemporary thought on the shape of the earth. Whewell also brought up Christian monk Cosma Indicopleistes from the 6th century, who wrote his magnum opus, Christian Topography, on a description of the physical universe based on a literal interpretation of the Bible. He taught that the earth was a disc or trapezium-shaped flat surface. However, he wrote this in Greek, and it wasn't translated to Latin until many centuries later, so he too did little to influence Western thought on the shape of the earth. Whewell and others, intent on painting a picture of science being held back by irrational religion, held up these two figures, who were relatively unknown during their own lifetime, as proof that most medieval peoples believe the world to be flat. This argument is perhaps best exemplified by New York Medical School chemist John William Draper in his book History of the Conflict Between Religion and Science, which was published in 1874. In this history, Draper argued how Roman Catholicism showed an animosity towards science since the 4th century all the way up until the 15th century, and that because of this animosity all throughout his time period, a quote-unquote intellectual night settled on Europe. He further argued that church fathers believed the natural world to be unimportant, and that they rejected all information that contradicted a literal interpretation of the Bible. I hope I have already shown by this point that an intellectual night never really overtook Europe, but if I haven't, I'll name off the top of my head well-known scientists and scientific advancements that occurred during Draper's given time period. All of these happen to be Christian, by the way. You got Roger Bacon, you got Paracelsus, Boethius, theory of Chartres, and farming technology in Europe, specifically heavier plows. Look, I know my list isn't exhaustive, but I promise you, this is just what I can list without looking anything up. Draper's book, however untrue, was an immediate success. The simplicity of his argument, as Garwood puts it, made it popular writing that was successful, because I quote, commentators now had a clear framework in which to order the development over time of deep and difficult concepts, rather than a disparate mass of opinions and theories, cross-currents and shifting tendencies. Tidy-minded historians, journalists, and popular writers now had a convenient, attention-grabbing, and straightforward system in which to file the events of the past. From the dark ages of superstition to the Enlightenment era and modern science. End quote. Continuing the idea of religion versus science, Andrew Dickson White, a University of Michigan professor and soon-to-be Cornell University president, wrote History of the Warfare of Science with Theology and Christendom in 1896 as a part of his crusade to establish Cornell as America's first secular university. His book, too, became highly successful and highly influential. However, it also had issues, painting every event in the history of science as one of science versus Christianity. While possible to do this with events contemporary to his life, such as the Darwinian debate over evolution, to do so with older history is, and was, bad historical practice, and as such, the work is filled with anachronisms and errors. Draper and White's books became bestsellers of the time, and the military metaphor of science versus religion seized the Western zeitgeist as true. Between 1870 and 1920, the framework of warfare became the standard way to analyze the relationship between science and religion. With both the myth of the Dark Ages and science being seen as the antithesis of religion during Irving's lifetime, it's easy to see why Irving's account of medieval people believing that the Earth was flat and Columbus discovering that it was round became hard fact. It was written into magazines and even school curriculums. Yet, almost all of it falls flat in terms of truth. See what I did there? Flat in terms of truth. Thank you very much for watching. I hope this video laid good background for future videos on flat Earth beliefs during the 19th and 20th centuries and how they interacted with mainstream science at the time. Just remember, history is far messier, complex, and most importantly, more interesting than I could ever capture in one video. Have an excellent day.